Pollaco, 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 matar a todos. Pollaco, pollaco. Pollaco, matar a todos. Pollaco, 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 matar a todos.
Yeah, not exactly sure what language you're speaking, bro, but I don't understand you. Yeah.
Pollacos, matar a todos.
Again, not exactly sure what language you're speaking, so I don't understand you.
Pollaco kill, pollaco muerte, pollaco.
Jacob, how are you?
What's going on, buddy? How you doing?
Oh, not too bad. How you been?
Not too bad. Where do I know you from on Google Hangouts?
We've had conversations back and forth. You probably let me put my actual icon up. You'll recognize it.
Soy pollaco, matar a todos.
Right?
Do I know you from Nadia's?
No.
No? Okay.
No. I mean, I watch Nadia's, but I don't really go in there because the people in there are pretty, they cover the base.
Right.
In other words, there's no room for my voice in there. So
Oh, yeah.
I yield.
I got you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like I feel squeezed out or anything. It's just like, I think I get the impression it's probably unfair across the board, but generally speaking, the room seems to be dominated usually by people who want to hear themselves talk and not hear what other people have to say necessarily. So that's what I mean by it. I don't think there's room for my voice in there.
Oh, I got you. Yeah, and I completely agree, by the way.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree, 100%. It's a bit of a lion's cage. I'll say that much.
Right, and so it's interesting to watch, but I wouldn't, I don't necessarily see anything productive and constructive that I could do by being in there.
Yeah, it took me a good month and a half to figure that out. I was in there every day over the past month and a half, 2 months.
Yeah.
And eventually had to leave because of the trolls ultimately. But that's the way the cookie crumbles.
You mean like somebody cutting you off and all that sort of stuff, or?
Well, so I had there's one person in specific that seems to be targeting me out, and I think it was because I was one of the only Christian theists in there. But they just it's like how can I explain this? So there are two different types of people that one can engage with, right? And one of them is the type of person that's interested in rational discourse, which I absolutely enjoy talking to. Whether they're an atheist or Hindu, Muslim, doesn't matter. Enjoy talking to them. Then you have your other people who are just interested in, talking over you and insulting you and that sort of thing. And when you're targeted, specifically when they come in the room, constantly, it gets to the point where you can no longer engage with the rest of the room. So I just had to leave ultimately because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm agnostic, but I see your point in reference to, when a Christian comes in the room, that seems to be like fresh meat.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually, not initially, but eventually.
And see, that part doesn't even really bother me, right? Like, so, you know, like I said, I really enjoy like rational discourse between myself and other folks, but uh, you know, you gotta pick your battles, right? So if you're dealing with people who are interested in conversation, that's one thing. When you're dealing with people who are interested in trolling, that's something completely different. It's not worth your time.
Yeah. So, what was your hope in terms of carrying out discourse? Was your hope to like share who you are and find out who others are, kind of thing, or I mean, what was your general scope of purpose for hoping to engage that way socially?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. So, I definitely have my agenda that's completely based around my Christian theism, which is ultimately, I hope, that the folks that I talk to, you know, to share the gospel with them and them come to Christ. But also, there's that other side of it, right? Where, you know, I just enjoy hanging out with people in Google Hangouts, and I love discussing philosophy and you know, hearing other people's worldviews, et cetera, that sort of thing. So it's a multifaceted thing.
And how did your experience compare with the reality, or how did your expectation compare with the reality?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, for the most part, most of the people in Nadia's Hangout that I've engaged with are interested in that sort of like rational discourse, right?
Oh yeah,
Granted, you know, some
I
people,
agree with you. Those voices, I think, get drowned out.
yes, they do. That's what exactly what I was going to say. Is that the problem is that there's no real moderation in that room ultimately, and the people that are given mods are typically the sort of people that would be trollish, right? Not all of them, but some of them. So there's no real like you know, law being laid down. If someone, if you're having a discussion with someone and you've been in that discussion for, I don't know, like a half hour to an hour, and you're getting somewhere, and then someone comes in and just starts hurling insults at you, you would expect you know, the moderators to say something about it, and that didn't end up happening. So, but yeah, most of the people in that room are seem to be more geared towards that sort of conversation. It's just you have the few that are not, and they tend to be like the loudest in the room, so you don't really get anywhere.
Yeah. So, what would you say if you had like an opportunity to give your perspective on what you think is valuable and why you hold the views you do in an elevator speech, so to speak? You know, if you had a maybe let's give it 25 floors, you know, so if you had like a minute and a half, 2 minutes to describe what it is that you think is important in life, what would you say?
Well, as far as you know, being important in life, obviously it would be the gospel. I would just be interested in sharing the fact that I believe it's the truth, definitely, that you know, that God exists, and that that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then ultimately, you know, my goal for anyone I talk to is that they be saved through Christ, and they know that a Christ who is God in flesh, you know, died on a cross and rose from the grave, and you're saved by grace through faith alone, Him alone, and for them to repent and come to the knowledge of Him. Right. That would be ultimately what I think life is and should be based around. But the problem is that so much of that gets bogged down in you know, like high ordered philosophical exchanges. So you rarely get a chance to get to that point. But so yeah, that would be the most important thing to me, definitely.
Okay, well that's fair enough. I mean, so let me paraphrase back to you and correct me if I'm off base. You have found something that you think is important from an eternal perspective, and that other people, by vector of sharing that knowledge of that, you feel like they would be better off, and so you attempt to share that. That seems to be centric to your philosophical spear tip, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. So I definitely think people are I mean, you know, would be better off. I mean, if you just even presupposing the Christian theist worldview, I mean, I think anyone could say that, right? Given that if Christian theism is ultimately true, then you know, those who are saved ultimately end up in eternity with Christ, and those who end up not saved do not. They end up in hell ultimately. So yeah, but I don't look at it in like a pragmatic way, right? So I don't just want people to come to Christ for like a fire insurance type thing, right? I would never sort of put it like that. Like there are a lot of people who put it like that, where it's like, I don't want you to burn in hell for eternity, so I'm sharing the gospel. I try to go at it at a different way, specifically because I look at it at a different way, right? I want people to come to Christ because I believe I know who he is with regard to how Scripture describes him to be, and I believe that he is worthy of ultimate worship from those who are on the earth ultimately, and I want people to experience that, but I also think it's the right thing to do. So again, it's a multifaceted thing.
Okay. Yeah. Well, my own perspective centers on the fact that I can't center in on any one position that isn't empirically grounded. That what you said about Christianity would be sincerely what someone who is brought up in another Abrahamic faith, let's say Islam, would say about you. That if you don't understand the way they understand and go through the rituals and motions and understandings that they feel are germane to get into heaven, then you yourself are destined for an eternity of hellfire and whatnot. And so, in other words, the argument that you made would be equally made with an arguably equal amount of sincerity, but yet no empirical anchor. And so, given the fact that I'm in a world where I can't differentiate which one is right, I just feel like, well, then the most rational place to be is agnostic. But that doesn't mean you have to be a jerk to people that are certain. Maybe they have something I don't. Maybe you have some knowledge I don't. That is quite possible. I haven't cornered the market on insight, and so while I certainly don't feel qualified to condemn anybody that holds one given belief over another, it appears to me, just from a cursory view, that there's some cultural adoption of whatever religion you happen to be born into, which seems a little more than coincidental. I think that human beings are highly social, and they buy into things that build some sort of a group coherence, and so ideas is sort of what we condense around that way socially. And so if you're born into a faith or get exposed to a faith where you can build some sense of belonging, then we as human beings have a tendency to do that, I think. Anyway, the point that I make is I can't really embrace one or the other without saying I don't have any more merit, or I can't perceive any higher weight for this one than that one, and so I just remain in the agnostic zone. But I do think there are more important fish to fry, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think that finding a way for us to recognize that our common ground is Earth, and that having each other's backs rather than being on each other's backs is a better recipe for a better experience of life, is what I'd like to promote. And so I think we certainly have some crossover values that we share, you and I, if you believe in loving one another and things like that. So I mean, I'm trying to put it in what I think in terms of what I would think your Christian lens would agree, the common ground.
Yeah, I definitely get what you're saying, right? And so, to speak on what you were talking about with regard to the reasons why people believe, et cetera, et cetera, I could totally understand why you would be an agnostic, right? And I sort of hold this view as a Christian theist, and not everyone holds this view, but I do, that ultimately beliefs are not the sorts of things that we choose, right? So when you have Christians, on my side of the fence, who would berate somebody and say, why don't you believe, why don't you believe? They have to understand, and some people on the atheistic side too have to also understand that beliefs are not the sorts of things we choose. And I've used this illustration many times because I think it's sort of relevant. It's like if you walk into a room and you see a red chair. It's not that you choose to believe certain things about the red chair. It's that by the mere nature of what the red chair is, you come to form belief about it. And that's sort of how I believe that Christian theism comes about, right? So as a Christian theist, I would say the reason why someone believes is specifically because the Holy Spirit saves them, right? Causes them to believe. But there's another aspect of this too, sidestepping that whole belief system, where, you know, 9 times out of 10 we are a product of how we were raised, right? But I don't want to use that as like a universal claim, because at the same time, there are tons of people out there who were specifically raised as Christian theists who ultimately ended up being atheists, right? Or ended up being agnostic, or Hindus, or Muslims. So I don't think that it's a necessary thing that we come to believe what we were raised as. But I definitely think that there's some causation there in some form or another with regard to the population. I had a conversation in Nadia's before I ended up leaving with a couple of atheists in there. And it was really interesting. I was talking to someone else about this. I think it was Beckel the other day. It was really interesting because they asked me, they said, you know, how did you come to believe in Christian theism? And I told them, I said, well, you know, just from a simplified answer, I was basically raised in it. And then I got to a point in my early 20s, when I was in my early 20s, where, you know, I did research. Like, I surrounded myself with nothing but atheists, like atheists that were way smarter than I was. And I wanted to hear their side of it. And I wanted to hear other people's side of it. And through that, it's a very painful experience. Through that, I still came to believe, right? I read the Gospels, and I just happened to believe. So, on one hand, I can point to certain, you know, causation variables with regard to my belief in Christian theism, and on the other hand, I have to just say, well, I read the Gospels and I ended up believing. And I think that uh, you know, again, it's a multifaceted thing. There are many different variables in play.
Yeah, fair enough. Like I said, I think what you described, though, if you were brought up in the Muslim faith, in other words, I just think that it seems to me that people that we are wired to sacrifice accuracy or even integrity or whatever on the altar of belonging. So one of the reasons that people fear public speaking more than they fear death, I think, is because we are so geared socially that one of the most terrifying things, you know, from our biological perspective, is to be expelled from the group, because historically speaking and evolutionarily speaking, we really aren't equipped to fend for ourselves. We need a group in order to survive. So I think that there's some intrinsic things that happen as a result of that, not the least of which is our willingness to bind to a group, even if we have to sacrifice accuracy on the altar of that belonging.
Right. Yeah. No. I definitely agree. There's a certain element of that. I think the ultimate question. I mean, this is just going to get pushed back. This is going to get pushed back ultimately to the question as to whether the Christian God exists or not. But so, and I think this is a common misconception too. So I don't discount the fact that there are secondary causes, such as a person growing up in a home that Christian cause for their Christian theism. I think even under my Christian theism, with regard to that and my philosophical values and beliefs, it's not mutually exclusive to both say that the reason why one believes in Christian theism may be because, one, they were raised in the Christian household, and two, also because the Holy Spirit has imparted in them, you know, the gift of salvation. So the idea, especially in Calvinism, because I'm a Calvinist, is that God ultimately is in control of everything, right? That He's sovereign over everything. And so I would say that, you know, that person being raised in that household would ultimately be a secondary cause. Sorry, a secondary cause and the ultimate decree that God decreed that they should ultimately be saved. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I hear. I mean, I hear what you're saying. Like I said, I don't. My own tastes, my own ability to embrace an idea has to be a little bit. I don't deny that there are possibilities like that could be in play, but I'm here. I'm now. I know that if I dance carelessly too close to a cliff, that I'm putting myself in danger. I know that because of empirical things that I can measure and test and all that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that's the only. Money is money because we all agree it's money. It's not. So there are social realities, and there are things that are communicated through reality itself. That the non-social variety of reality, and so I think that because we are here and because we are now, that those things that are there and then, like what is the origin of the universe and stuff like that, are sort of in terms of priority, at least in my mind, they are less of it is less of a priority to figure out those far and away over the horizon things that may or may not be, from my perspective, than it is to figure out the near term things, like the fact that we have to cultivate nourishing relationships in order to get fed here on planet Earth. And so that means a certain amount of cooperative things going on, fruitful relationships, if you will, that can generate the kind of wealth in terms of food and whatnot that we need. So I think that we need to really focus on how to do those things first, and then worry about the other more ethereal and further out things after that. So from my perspective, worrying about whether or not there is a God or isn't a God is much like worrying about what kind of sprinkles to put on the cupcake while the kitchen's on fire. It's just not important. So it's just.
I got you. Yeah, can you hold on 1 minute, bud? I got to carry in the groceries.
Yeah, I actually I'm going to get my wife an ice pack. She texted me, so I'll tell you what. We'll both be back in about a minute or so. How's that?
All right, sounds good, bud.
All right, bye. I am back if you are.
All right, I'm back.
All right then. So, do you agree that as a global culture, we kind of need to figure out how to get along with each other in ways that, you know, in other words, if I have fishing hooks and you have fishing line and we share, that's good. But if I use my fishing hook to try and gouge you and you use your fishing line to try and strangle me, that's probably, you know, going to reshape our experience of life in not a way that we're ever going to catch fish, right? So there's a fundamental benefit that comes from having each other's backs. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it. So, all right. So I can imagine some situations in which maybe strangling the person. This is gonna sound bad. Which strangling the person may be the morally correct thing to do. Like, say for instance, if you have parents, and I'm going way off on a tangent here, but just to sort of illustrate a point. If you have parents that are trying to protect their children, and the only way to protect their children is to do so, that might be a thing that would be morally permissible to do. But in general, I'm definitely granting the premise that that sort of thing you mentioned in general would be a good thing. Yes.
Well, let me rephrase it to be more clear so that, you know, the example that you gave isn't relevant, hopefully. And that is, if I have a vested interest in your best, in your success and your children's success, and I you know, would act in a way that would support that, you know, full backing, you know, so to speak, and you did that for me, rather than us being at war with each other for whatever reason, whether it's ideological or competing for, you know, resources or whatever. In other words, if we had a win-win situation where you had my back and I had your back, that is a better situation than if I'm competing with you or I'm actually trying to get something from you parasitically or predatorily. That's what I'm saying. It's like, in other words, the relationship dynamic of having each other's back is better than any relationship dynamic that is less than that. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think in general it is. Okay. Right. So where a society where you have people helping one another is definitely right. Would definitely be preferable to one in which you have folks who are parasitic, as you put it. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I think that it is important for us as a globe to get that point. And the reason is the fulcrum, using technology as a fulcrum, we can leverage a whole lot more behavior with one little button these days. And so if we're at war with each other, we can really cause some damage with, you know, with technology as a lever, as a mechanism to increase the power of our punch, so to speak. And so I think our most important issue on Earth is not whether or not there's a God. I think that our most important issue on Earth is how do we conduct ourselves as a unified body of life so that we have each other's backs. That's what, you know, and so that's what I focus on, as opposed to which religion should you pick from the from my perspective, unintelligible morass of people convinced of certainty without any more evidence than each other. And like I said, I could be missing something, but that's what it looks like to me.
Well, let me ask you a question, because it seems that what you're suggesting is based upon a fundamental assumption. And this is why I think the question as to whether God exists and who he is very relevant, right? So the fundamental assumption that seems to be behind your assertion of your perfect worldview, or the world, or of the world that you would want to live in, seems to be that humans ought thrive, or that humans themselves.
I'm sorry, what? Humans are what?
That humans ought thrive or flourish, right? That seems to be at the fundamental assumption behind the sort of worldview that you're talking about. So, if that is the case, then my question to you is, why ought we believe that? Like, I know it's something that we might desire, right? So I definitely agree with you. Like, I desire it. Society as a whole may desire it, but why ought it be something that we should strive for?
Well, that's a pretty good question. So let me just clarify something about I don't, first and foremost, I don't know whether a perfect world is achievable at all. I think we can improve on what we do now, based on some things that we can know. Where that leads to, I have no idea. But in other words, we could all sing Kumbaya tomorrow and get hit by an asteroid. I have no clue, right? But I think that the opportunity by which we author our own poverty by being combative with each other and or excessively destructive of the environment that we depend on. In other words, if we dominate the environment as opposed to cultivate the environment, we could, when the monopoly game is won, it's all over. So I'm just saying that it's not a good idea, at least from my perspective, based on what I know. And I think based on what anybody could know, with just a cursory look at the way things work on planet Earth. So that being said, I am not a utopian by any stretch, and neither am I a pacifist. But I am saying that it is better for us to cooperate than it is for us to be combative with each other. So that and then the second point of the premise of what you fed back to me, at least of your understanding of my understanding and my understanding of your understanding of my understanding. Let's not get meta here, but is that it's human-centric. I don't think human beings alone are the point. I think that, in fact, we are so interwoven with what we currently call other creatures. Like, for instance, we can't breathe without plants and certain even viruses that actually produce oxygen in the atmosphere. So all that to say, and they can't live, the plants can't live without us. So we are like organs in the same body. We have to cultivate relationships in order to sustain a planet-wide metabolism for us to continue. So and so with that in mind, your question to me is, why would you want to do that? What is the impetus for that? Well, I don't know, but I do know this. I know that if I get really, really hungry, I am driven to eat. And I also know that given, at population levels, we are also driven to reproduce, to continue in some way, to pass the torch generation after generation, and or to live eternally ourselves, perhaps, if that were possible, and maybe it is, who knows. But the point being that we do have some innate drives to maintain our coherency over time. And with that in mind, one of the best ways to do that is to develop a sustainable relational system. And that's all I'm talking about. Is that we're doing things. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I got a dog also. Let me just say real quick. So, I totally agree with you, right? So, I think that is a tough question when we ask, why ought humans thrive? But let me just point out that basically everything that you're saying, I'm agreeing with regard to, wanting to help other people, wanting to cause society to thrive, as well as being a contributing member of society, et cetera, et cetera. I think those are all great things. But where I disagree with you is that we can't somehow do that and also ponder the great question, which is ultimately whether God exists and who he is, right? As a matter of fact, I would say, and I know there are other atheists who would disagree with me on this, I would say that for some people at least, pondering that question and coming to the conclusions that they have has caused them to be a better contributing member of society, while also fueling certain aspects of the human condition that would be conducive to the sorts of societal changes that one might be aimed after with regard to technology and folks being driven to innovate, et cetera, that sort of thing. So I don't think it's like an all or nothing, right? Or it's one or the other. Rather, I think that we can still do those sorts of things and also ponder the question and discuss it and try to figure the answer out. I just think the problem that you run into is with folks who do things in the name of religion that others might consider to be destructive, and then folks on the other end of that destruction, or folks who sort of sit back, see religion as a whole, not just Christian theism, but religion as a whole, and they say to themselves, well, see, religion itself is ultimately a hindrance to that sort of thriving that we're after. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think the problem is religion itself. And I'm not saying you're making this argument, so I'm trying not to straw man you. I'm just sort of answering a common objection. I don't think religion is the issue. I think it's a human heart issue, right? It's the same thing with someone holding a fork or a knife or a gun, for that matter, because that's another issue that's raised up today. So religion by itself can't do anything. If you mean and if I mean religion to be a certain set of beliefs about where we come from and who God is and whether he exists or not, just like a butter knife or a fork by itself can't do anything, just like a gun by itself can't do anything, right? But when you add a human with a certain state of their hearts, then that's really what becomes the ultimate question, because what a tool for eating, right, as a fork in the heart of a good person is a wonderful thing, right? You can feed yourselves, you can feed others, you can feed the poor, you can feed the sick, etc. A butter knife or a knife in the heart of someone good is a great thing, right? You can cut your own food up, you can cut someone's food up who's poor, or maybe doesn't have any teeth or can't feed themselves, etc. Religion, used by someone who has a heart that is conducive to the sorts of things that we might deem to be good, can be a wonderful thing, right? But there's a flip side to it, because we're not just one-dimensional, we're three-dimensional creatures. We're both good, I think, and evil, right? I would actually argue more evil than good. Actually, from my Christian theist worldview, according to God's standards, I would say no one does good. But from a societal standpoint, we can do some good and some bad. And when you get those sorts of people who are aiming to do what they think is right, which is in fact evil with regard to religion, then you run into those sorts of problems. But I don't think that because we view that, we ought to, and again, I'm not accusing you of making this argument, just sort of preempting some things that I've heard in media, that somehow we ought view religion in that light, just like we ought not view guns in that light, or a steak knife, or a sword, or fist, for that matter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I certainly think that any technology has the more good it can do. I don't know whether it's equally balanced, but the more evil it could do, if you're using good and evil as axioms. I don't believe in good and evil. I believe in constructive and destructive things. So if you swill down some cyanide, the ATP production in your cells is going to cease, and you will collapse and you will die. And so ultimately, there are things that can happen that are destructive to you, and you want to tend to making sure that you maintain a nourishing environment for yourself if you want to continue. if you want to continue to carry out activities and whatnot. So from my perspective, it is in our vested interest to just have each other's backs. And like I said, from my perspective, it does appear like religion is a lesser priority than cultivating the kinds of relationships that engage us to go forward and continue and experience a full experience of life. So let me give you an example of the mindset that springs out of this notion of mine, if I can. There are children, I think it's somewhere around the 20,000 mark, give or take, that die every day of starvation-related disease and or direct starvation every day. And we live in a world where at some point in time we cross the threshold where we don't live in a world where we can't feed those people. We live in a world where we don't feed those people, and that's a statement of our values. And those values say that this child, mind you, they need more than food. I understand that, and I'm really not trying to pull the child card. I'm just saying that is destructive, because you don't know if there's a Jonas Salk in there, or an Albert Einstein, or someone who discovers, anti-gravity, or who the heck knows what we have yet to discover, because they weren't cultivated to their full potential, and to the degree that they weren't even given access to basic food necessities, which we need to do to cultivate our young. So we live in that kind of a world where those things are going, and yet we're applying energy to whether or not how many angels dance on the head of a pin. I think that's a waste of time. It's like I said, that's just my perspective. That's all. In other words, it's not necessarily a waste of time once those other things are figured out, but I think it's a lesser priority. It's probably a better way of saying it than a waste of time. It's not a waste of time. It's just an out of order priority.
I got you. Well, let me ask you a question. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Christian God exists, right? Would you still think that it would be a lesser priority?
Yes, we're here now.
Okay, so this is interesting. Do you believe it's impossible to both ponder the question and search while also taking care of the poor and taking care of those issues that you're speaking about?
Well, that would be demonstrated by the fact that all those issues are being taken care of. So I would say, I would answer your question, well, I guess in theory it's possible, but in practice it's not happening. And so we need to attend our energies and our focus to that other thing of cultivating each other to our fullest potential first, and then we can work out whether or not, Jesus died on a cross for our sins and rose on. I don't know if you're a Nicene Creed or Calvinist or whatever flavor of whatever brand of Christianity. I don't care. But I'm just saying that we have to tend to the things that are here and now, and those things are there and then. To me, that's all.
I got you. Well, I'm just asking questions to sort of figure out where you're at here. Is your contention that the reason why we're not taking care of those issues is because we're asking the question about God and trying to search to figure out if he exists or not?
It's a good question. I hadn't thought of it. I mean, I don't think that, I think that to the degree that we burn energy on that is energy that could otherwise be more constructively devoted to a higher priority thing. I do think that. So yeah, I guess in some sense that's true, but that doesn't mean that I'm attacking the notion of the argument that it's moot and it should never be considered or anything else. I'm just saying I think there's higher priorities.
I got you. So what do you do with folks who feed the poor because they believe that God exists?
And what do you do with folks who feed the poor because they're poor? What do you do? There's two different. You can cultivate a dependency and you can cultivate a self-sufficiency. I mean, you look like you're a parent based on your avatar there. is your hope that you raise your children to the point where they are able to negotiate, at least as you understand it, the social waters and the earthen, like environment, to have a fulfilling life? Is that is that kind of what you aim your energies at?
Sure, that's one aspect of it, but I don't personally believe that I can fully do that without properly conveying the love of Christ to my child. Right.
Okay.
So, in other words, this is why I said it's not like an all or nothing thing, or it's not an either or. It's very intermingled. Like, so you have to think of the Christian worldview as a sort of it's a sort of pair of glasses. Like, you're looking at the world through the glasses of Christian theism. And everything having to do with the thriving of society or contributing to society or morality, et cetera, is intermingled into that worldview. So it's not as if, I'm burning a bunch of energy towards Christian theism that I could be using somewhere else. No, it's quite, in fact, the opposite, right? So one of the reasons why I might want to take care of some of the issues that you were talking about is specifically because I'm a Christian theist, right? To give an example, I believe that it is definitely a man's job to find a job and to take care of his family. I think it's a very important thing, and I think that we get that from Scripture. I think it's one of the man's roles. Not that women can't work, let me preface that, but that it is especially a job of the husband and the man to do. So by mere fact that I'm dedicated to my Christian theism, I'm motivated by a sort of variable that is non-secular to, in fact, contribute to society. Likewise, if I were to walk down the street and see a poor person, my heart would bleed for them specifically, not only because of my upbringing or any sort of social constructs that might be going on, but also because of my Christian theism. Specifically because, I want to be more like Christ, and I want to do what Christ commands me to do. Christ commands me to ultimately feed the poor, therefore I want to feed the poor, right? And there are tons of things like this. So I think we have to think about this as a more commingled, cohesive worldview that is not necessarily separate from the sorts of goals that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I can understand that with your worldview that you encapsulate it in those sorts of membranes as if they motivate your behaviors. But my guess would be that if you saw a poor person and you didn't hold Christian faith, that you might have the same or similar kind of motivations to reach out and lift them up. And you might even have an understanding of male biology. You got a little bit more musculature. There's some sexual dimorphism going on. So, you're more muscular. You have the ability to go out and swing the sword, so to speak, a little better. And you got to protect that inner core of the child rearing and the nurturing that has to go on in the home. So you're kind of the rough the defensive exterior of that womb that is necessary to continue life, and those are your roles too. That they're expressed and written right into the nature of biology as well. And so I'm just thinking to myself that while you do frame it in those terms, in those little abstract bubbles of Christianity, they're sort of ancillary. They're not necessarily core or motivational. They are just along for the ride, from my perspective.
Right. Well, I mean, so I would definitely have to disagree with you. I think that so let me agree with you on one hand, right? So I definitely agree with you that a Christian belief is not required to do the sorts of things that I'm mentioning, right? So I'm definitely not making that argument. I know there are a lot of people on my side of the fence who make that argument. Like, they'll say stupid things like, atheists can't have morality because they don't believe in God. That's just stupid. That's absolutely retarded for reasons I won't go into. But what I am saying is that just like the atheist or secularist, the Christian worldview can also be a motivation to take care of some of those things that you were talking about. So I do see them as motivations, right? I definitely see them as motivations in my own life. Very powerful Very, very, very powerful motivation.
All right. Well, let me ask you this: Do you when if you said to yourself, "I'm thirsty. I'm going to get a drink of water," are those words that you're using a motivator or an ancillary thing? In other words, what I'm trying to drive at is your biology is compelling you to satisfy a thirst, and your words are just like reporting. They're along for the ride, so to speak. Right? Is that a fair statement?
Not to split hairs, but I think ultimately there is an aspect of the words themselves sort of being a causation, right? Because it could be the case, and again, I'm just probably splitting hairs here. It could be the case, in fact, that the moment that you utter the words, I'm thirsty, I need a drink, that the mere fact that you're reflecting on the fact that you're thirsty causes you to be more thirsty. So I wouldn't necessarily say that with 100%, but I get where you're going with it.
My point was, there are biological drive, like a dog doesn't think I am thirsty, I need water. It doesn't use that language, but it knows that it's thirsty, and it knows that it wants water somehow without those words. And I'm saying that the words are ancillary in that particular case, in that just narrow case where we are driven to satisfy a thirst. In this case, let's just, for the broad perspective, use the word hunger, even though it's water you're hungry for, so to speak. All right, can we agree to that?
I'm sorry, could you rephrase and repeat that?
Well, I'm just saying, what I'm trying to get at is biological drives or biological hungers, one of which is to satisfy our hunger for water. All right, I'm just using the word hungry universally to say that whenever we're driven to satisfy a biological drive, I'm calling it a hunger. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so you're hungry to get something to drink, and you get something to drink to satisfy that hunger, so to speak. And if you didn't speak any words, that whole behavioral process would have happened anyway, right?
Well, yeah, obviously. I mean, you could have someone who is mute, and you'd still end up being thirsty and then having a good drink, right?
Yes, or somebody that didn't know language that was thirsty and yeah, yes, all of that. And so my point is that in many cases, our words are just along for the ride. Not all cases. I'm not disputing what you're saying about the fact that words do and can have power to motivate. I'm not disputing. I'm not trying to rule that out. So I'm stating my purpose and just going like, there are a whole bunch of things that are just biologically driven that our words are just sort of along for the ride for, in terms of the way that we're describing the process. We're not actually motivated to carry these things out because of words. Our words just report and explain the fact that these things happen. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, sure. The words are, definitely.
Yeah, in those cases. Now, in other cases, like for instance, the case of money, John Searle uses this notion he calls collective intentionality, and while that's probably too many syllables to explain what the thing is, it's a good point. So that money, if you made an exact replica of a $100 bill, it would be counterfeit, even if it was exact to the nth detail. And the reason it would be counterfeit is because it wasn't through the authorities that be and all of that. And so money is a social construct in that we have certain rules for how it gets created, how it's distributed, what it is, and all of that sort of thing. And so in that particular case, that sort of idea and how we arrange our behaviors around money is predicated on the words. They're not necessarily predicated on a biological hunger of any type. Is that a fair statement?
Let me just try to recap what you're saying with that last statement. That ultimately something such as money is a social construct Therefore, it's not predicated ultimately upon any sort of biological process. Is that what you're saying?
In rough terms, yeah. I mean, I'm adding that now. So yeah, yes, that is exactly what I said, but I'm trying to qualify it a little bit further to say, yes, in rough terms, it doesn't, if the world did not have money, we would still, we wouldn't like cease to exist. But if you ceased having water, you would cease to exist.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely obvious for sure.
That being said, there's two kinds of things. Ones that are created by the power of the word, and ones that are, just innate. They're natural. These things are natural, and I think sometimes we conflate them. One of the things that is natural is to recognize that at some level, at least for the most part of us, that we rely on this social entity in order to feed ourselves. Like, for just a given, for instance, no one on earth, and this is a true statement, no one on earth knows how to make a pencil. And yet we have pencils. And what do I mean when I say that? I forget the guy's name, but somebody wrote a book called I Pencil, described the pencil from the pencil's perspective. But what it described was the metallurgist and the person who ground the pigments for the paint, and the person and all the distribution technology, and the lumberjack, and the technology for processing the wood, and the machinery, and the distribution process, and the people that know how to run the store, and the blah 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 for the pencil to ultimately get to you. No one person knows all that stuff on earth, and yet by sinewy connections, like neuronal connections, social connections between people working together, we can produce something that no one of us individually could produce at all. And so ultimately, the fact that we do work together and do things, we can have these kinds of things that we wouldn't otherwise have. And so I think that there is an intrinsic recognition at some point in our lives, in our brains, in our actions, and all of that, that we recognize this need for community in order to have this kind of, let me call it wealth, okay, for lack of a better word. And that's a sloppy word, but please allow me to just, I'm using language is like trying to pop a basketball with a wet noodle sometimes. It's just inadequate to the task. But I think you know what I mean when I say better things happen, and you can do more things through that cooperative relationship. And I think as human beings, we recognize that that is how our, the stability of our lifestyles and how we can get food into the stores and all of that is done. If we all fought against each other, that sort of stuff wouldn't happen. And so based on that, I do think that there are times when we cooperate with each other and lend a hand for each other because of that intrinsic biological recognition that may be a lot like the dog that knows it's thirsty but doesn't know the word thirsty and doesn't need to know the word thirsty, that we recognize things innately that we haven't necessarily wrapped words around, or we have wrapped symbolic words like, I'm a Christian and therefore I love everybody and blah, but they are actually driven from some innate biological natural drive, and we have just wrapped these words around them. And that, from my perspective, it just sort of looks like that. And hey, I could be absolutely wrong about the whole thing.
Well, sure, definitely. I could definitely see from your worldview how you would come to that conclusion. But keep in mind also that what you're suggesting, as far as biological variables being in play with regard to certain motivations, that's not mutually exclusive with the sorts of motivations that are innate within Christian theism, right? So the idea in Christian theism is that ultimately everything that's caused is caused by God, and you would expect to see, if in fact God, like that exists within Christian theism, what you expect to see would be that he would use certain things such as biological motivations, etc., etc. So yeah, I could definitely see that.
So God caused cancer?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm a Calvinist, so
yeah, okay. Yeah. So anyway, look, that's my perspective. I get that certainty is not something I can lay claim to. I can only say that this is my perspective based on my best ability to perceive. I certainly haven't cornered the market on solid insight or certainty. It's just, kind of where I'm at based on what I've been exposed to.
All right, buddy. I got to get off here. My daughter needs me real quick.
All
It was
right.
good talk. It was good talking to you, though.
Good talking to you too. I hope we can do it again sometime in the future.
All right, buddy. Talk to you later.
All right, Jacob. See you.